Hi everyone, welcome to Doing Sociology. In today's book discussion, we will be talking to Dr. Roluahpuia about his latest book, Nationalism in the Vernacular, States, Tribes, and the Politics of Peace in Northeast India. A little bit about him. Dr. Roluahpuia obtained his PhD from the Tata Institute of Social Sciences, TISS Northeast Regional Campus, Guwahati. He won the Arvind Raghunathan and Sri Bala Subramanian South Asia Visiting Fellowship in 2018-19 at the South Asia Institute of Harvard University in the US. He has held teaching and fellow positions at the Center for the Study of Developing Societies, New Delhi, and IIT Guwahati. And he is currently serving as an assistant professor of sociology at the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences, IIT Roorkee. His published work has appeared in noted journals, including Asian Ethnicity, Contemporary South Asia, Himal South Asian, Journal of Borderlands Studies, Nations and Nationalism. Dr. Puia's research interest broadly covers, among others, identity, nationalism, development, and borderland studies. And his latest book has Nationalism in the Vernacular, States, Tribes, and the Politics of Peace in Northeast India, was published in 2023 by the Cambridge University Press. Very happy to have you with us today, Puia, and looking forward to this discussion.
The pleasure's all mine, and thank you for inviting me.
Right. You begin your book by engaging with the subject of the tribal question in India. How do you see this tribal question?
Well, I think it's a good starting point to talk about the tribal question, also because I have tried to address it, in the initial part of my book, but particularly in the chapter 2. So the national question in India has been studied, analyzed, and critiqued from various angles and viewpoints. For instance, the work of Aparajita on the idea of the nation as within quote a fragment points to how different social groups imagine and relate to the idea of Indian nation state. Now, similarly, we have feminists who have posited and engaged with the idea of national identity and nationhood, critiquing the masculinist ideologies and erasures of women's contribution to the freedom movement, for instance. Likewise, we have different scholars that have examined the idea of the nation from different vantage points, such as Muslims and Dalits, and how these social groups in India are integral to the idea of India or the making of India. So, although I did not engage with such works in detail in my book, this is what I have in mind, and of course, I also have made certain reference to the scholarships that I have just mentioned. So, and in this context, there has been little engagement when it comes to tribes. So, in fact, the engagement of the tribal question in India remains restricted to what is commonly known as the integration isolation debate, basically the Gurye-Elwin debate. And this has dominated the discourse around the tribal question in India, particularly at the dawn of India's independence. So even till today, scholars often go back to this debate as a starting point to understand the tribal question. So while this debate is a very good or a helpful starting point, it in many ways subsume or if not silence the voice of the tribes themselves. That is, one part of how I engage with the tribal question. Now, the other part is that the discourse on tribes is dominated by the idea of within quote mainstreaming them or integrating them into the national mainstream. Again, this was more or less part of the national integrationist project, particularly during again the early years of independent India, and mainstreaming the tribes emerged as a kind of meta-narrative among policymakers, political leaders, as well as academicians. Now, while the idea of what constitutes the national mainstream is never clearly defined, it presupposes that tribes are the, within quote, other, and this idea of othering tribes as the other reeks of, a kind of dominant idea of nationhood, where tribal communities or communities belonging to tribe or tribal communities or communities who are designated as tribes in the Constitution of India should assimilate themselves with the cultural mainstream. Now, this idea of mainstreaming the tribes remained dominant, particularly in the literature of sociology and anthropology concerning tribes. And politically in India, tribes in many parts of India were quite integrated into the larger social and cultural fabric of the country. And in many ways, they have also contributed significantly to the making of the nation. And if you look at, contemporary India in the last, even if you go back to, the last 4 to 5 decades, see that, there is no part of tribal areas which is not integrated, despite, that there are tensions and contestations surrounding surrounding national identity. So I feel that, it is more helpful to understand the issue of tribes or the tribal question, and it is better, or it is academically or scholarly useful to approach it from the idea of inclusion rather than engaging it as a problem of national integration or an issue of trying to mainstream tribals. So this idea of inclusion, I have taken inspiration from the work of Dalit scholars such as Gopal Guruji, Aloysius, among others, who have talked about or who have engaged with the possibility of thinking and advancing an egalitarian idea of nationhood. So for many tribes as well, the question, how I look at the tribal question, is about the terms and conditions in which they were to be made part of the Indian nation state, and what are the kind of possible futures that India as a nation promise to these communities who are known as tribes within the broader idea of India. So this is, to my mind, this is something which, which can, unpack the issues concerning tribes, their concerns, as well as, their political aspirations.
Right. So could you also lay out the socio-political and economic context that led to the emergence of Mizo-nationalism and subsequently the Mizo-National Front movement? How did, these two factors also lead to the formation of a Mizo identity?
Okay. Well, I will answer that. I will answer the question separately. I will begin by responding to the second part of the question. Now, in relation to how the movement or how the Mizo movement lead to the formation of Mizo identity. Now, in many ways, Mizo identity predates the emergence of Mizo nationalism under the Mizo National Front. So, because Mizo National Front as a political organization or even a political party was established only in the year 1961, Mizo identity was already in existence much prior to the emergence of MNF. For example, it made its appearance during colonial period, particularly in the print culture, where certain newspapers were already carrying the names of Mizo, the term Mizo. For example, we have Mizo Levai Chanchin, Chanchin Bu, we have Mizo Chanchin Laisui, which were published in the later part of the 19th century. Now, however, in many ways, the emergence of the MNF in Mizoram consolidates the idea of Mizo identity, not as a mere tribal identity, but it promotes or it advances an understanding of Mizo identity as a NAM, as a nation. So this is something which is distinct about how the MNF looks at the idea of Mizo identity. Now, while Mizos are recognized as scheduled tribes under the Constitution of India, the idea of Mizo Nam, as per how the MNF looks at it, relates to how they view themselves as constituting a distinct nation. So, as with Mizo identity, while the book essentially does, what the book essentially does is tracing how Mizo themselves have taken the lead in demanding the recognition of Mizo identity by replacing, the colonial, not exactly the colonial, but the term which was popularized by the British, which is known as the Lushai. So likewise, Lushai Hills. So what I have, tried to do by looking at, Mizo identity is how Mizos themselves or Mizo nationalism or the making and the construction of Mizo identity was something which has emerged from within. And in many ways, it was, the MNF which has only re-established the idea of Mizo identity. So now coming to the first part of the question, the socio-political context of the emergence of the MNF movement. Now, the MNF movement, emerged at a time when there was a major political shift in, in Northeast India, or what the political scientist S.K. Chaubey called hill politics in Northeast India. Now, many of the existing studies on the MNF movement trace the emergence of the MNF to the famine that struck Mizo Hills or Mizoram in 1959. Now, in most academic and scholarly literature, what we have essentially is that there is a deep connection between the famine that that led to the devastation of Mizoram during the 1950s and during the later part of the 1950s. However, in my work, I made some, a kind of departure where I trace the emergence of the MNF or Mizo nationalism by taking a more longitudinal approach. Now, while the MNF did emerge as a voluntary organization to tackle the famine, and definitely, it later reconverted itself as a political party in the year 1961. But my argument is that the idea of Mizo nationalism predates the emergence of the MNF. For instance, if you look at, if you closely look at Mizo political history, particularly at the dawn of India's independence, the Mizo public opinion was divided between what we call the integration or the independence debate. So there were sections of Mizo populations who were always keen to integrate with Indian Union. There were also certain sections who desired the independence of independence of Mizo people. Now, whether or not they have a choice or they have such kind of option at the in the years leading to India's independence is a different matter. But the point is that there was always these tensions in Mizo political discourse between two diametrically opposing ideas, where one section is vouching for integration, the other for independence. Now, a political party, the first political party in Mizo Hills, which was the forerunner in terms of propagating the idea of integration with integration of Mizoram with Indian Union, was the Mizo Union. Now, the Mizo Union has opted for the integration of Mizoram with the Indian Union, and so it was and by the 1960s. There were several political developments that were happening apart from the famine. Was the attempt by the Assam government to impose Assamese as a language of the state. Now it has resulted into wide discontentment among the hill communities, particularly in Mizoram, Meghalaya, and many and some other parts which were under Assam. Now, in many ways, one could say that of course, the famine of 1959, the role of the famine of 1959 cannot be undermined. But there were other factors at play, such as the experience of discrimination that the Mizos face, when they move outside of Mizoram, and the failure of the Sixth Schedule to protect their political interests, because the Mizo Union was the leading campaigner for for the formation of Mizo District Council under the Sixth Schedule of the Constitution of India. So it was a mixture of many factors and many issues, and somehow all these issues catapulted the MNF when it made its political appearance in the 1960s.
Okay, so shall I continue?
Yes.
Okay, I thought that you were going to add to your answer, but thank you so much for that. Could you also tell us a little bit about what do you mean by the vernacularization of nationalist ideas, and what about its own significance in your study of Mizo nationalism? Why was such a vernacularization needed? So, if you could elaborate through your own study of Nam and Ram that you do in your book.
Yeah, well, I think the idea of vernacular is at the heart of my book, and I wanted to respond to this by providing the context in which I came to develop the idea of vernacularization of nationalist ideas. Now, I began my PhD fieldwork in early January 2015, And I was, struck by the way in which my research respondents or research participants position themselves and talk about the movement. Now, when I was developing my PhD proposal, and when I, made up my mind that, I wanted to study the MNF movement, what I intend to explore is, the common question in ethnicity and nationalism research, which is, why do people rebel? Now, I find that, many of my research respondents, I identified themselves to be as song composers, and many of my research participants label the movement as Zalen Naswal, basically, which a literal translation would mean freedom struggle. And the movement struggle and sacrifice they made were framed as for Ramle Nam, for our land and nation. So I must add that, the vernacular literature on the MNF movement is one of the most widely published, read, contested, debated, and these writings, have emerged largely from the former rebels themselves. So in such writings, particularly in books and articles, many of, the former rebels continue to use the term Zalenna. For example, a noted leader in the movement has written, several volumes of the movement. And, for the title of his book is Zoram in Zalenna as well, Zoram Struggle for Freedom. Now, as such, even today, this is how they look back at the movement. So needless to say, this contradicts the way in which academic literature and writings about sociopolitical movements in the Northeast represents them, which homogeneously club every kind of movement as insurgency, ethnic conflict, which is caused by alienation and geographical isolation of the region from the mainstream politics or mainly in India. Now, pick any book on Northeast India, and you will find, how most books will carry the term insurgency. And even, in the Mizo context, this is how academic literature has, been writing about the movement. So in many ways, there is a total erasure of the political agency of the communities and the homogenization of the socio-political movements through the use of terms such as insurgency. To my mind, is not only statist, but it is also very convenient and simplistic. So due to this, existing literature on the movement provides a very, very linear view of the movement, particularly MNF, such, movements such as the MNF movement, often starting with chronology of how the movement started using, the famine as a starting point, and then ending with the signing of the Mizo Accord. Now, I was, struck, when I went to the field that, none of my respondents, even people who have joined mainstream politics, today the Mizo National Front, which was once a rebel, a rebel group, has successfully transformed itself as a regional political party. Now, even among leaders or even party workers who have joined who are part of the MNF, none of them use the term insurgency. None of them use the term ethnic conflict. Now, so I began to explore in detail the idea of Zalenna, that is freedom, and Ramle Nam, land and nation. And this took me to a kind of serendipitous finding of how Hla, that is songs, were instrumental in shaping the ideas of Mizo nationalism. Now, Hla has, songs, have, a very, very significant role if one is to really look at, or understand Mizo society of the past, present, and of the past and present. Now, at one level, Mizo culture is largely an oral culture. So the use of songs was, easily receptive to the communities. At another level, what I have observed is that the idea of Zalenna and the use of Zalenna and Ramle Nam were about creating a vernacular language where the ideas of the nation and nationalism were reframed in the local. Now, by, the MNF, in many ways were successful in mobilizing the Mizo public largely because they creatively tap into the oral culture of Mizo society. Now, further to this, what vernacularization also did is that it enabled us to understand Mizo nationalism from the socio-cultural milieu of Mizos themselves. So it is, to me, turning the table because it no longer, looks at the MNF movement as mere insurgency or, mere ethnic conflict or state society conflict between people living, the communities living in the periphery and their resentment against, the central state. So terms, such as Zalena and Ramle Nam were widely integrated into the songs that were composed. And during the period, or maybe from the 1950s onwards, there was a new genre of songs that emerged in Mizoram, which is known as Namhla, that is national songs. And this Namhla acted as a kind of a resource to politically mobilize the communities, not only within Mizoram, but also beyond Mizoram, such as in Manipur, where Mizos live, as well as in Tripura. So it in many ways, enabled the spread of Mizo nationalist ideas. And even till today, if you look at, Mizo political culture, even the mainstream political culture, we find that, songs continue to play a very, very pivotal role in terms of spreading the manifestos of political party. Whenever there is any kind of political mobilization in Mizo Hills, you will see that, organizations will recruit popular Mizo singers that will, that will not only entertain, the public, but also will be engaged in spreading the ideas of Mizo nationalism. So in many ways, I feel that, to understand and explain not only the MNF movement, but also to understand contemporary ethnic mobilization in Mizoram, or particularly in the context of the Mizos in Northeast India, we have to seriously take, how, the interplay between songs and politics, and how, the Mizos have creatively, adapted, the ideas of, say, nationalism in their own context.
Right. Thank you for that very elaborate answer, Puia. And just before I move on to the next question, just wanted to mention that when somebody picks up your book, like this happened with me, you read vernacularization, you understand it has to do with language, etc., or maybe but then it was so surprising to know that you write about songs. So yeah, so to all those people who will be watching, I mean, definitely read the book. Because it is also full of surprises, and like in a very interesting and in a very good way. Yeah, so having said that, I just would like to move to the next question, where in your book you've talked about village groupings. Right now, village groupings is something that we'd like you to talk about. What were village groupings, and particularly in the context of the Mizo society, what were they, or how were they done or organized, and what was also unique about the Rambue laws which were composed during this period when the village groupings were happening in Mizoram?
Yeah. Well, Deepali, thank you so much for that observation. And, my obsession with vernacularization is also essentially that, how do I tell the story of Mizo movement in the way that, my research respondents would like to tell to the larger audience. So that was something that I have in mind. So anyway, coming to the question, what is village grouping and the significance of Roluahpuia? Now, village grouping were a counterinsurgency strategy that is, used to group populations into larger villages. Now, it is a very, common counterinsurgency strategy, widely practiced and known by different names, such as camps or concentration camps, new villages, development poles, strategic hamlets. So it is, used, for example, widely used during the Vietnam War. It is used, by the colonial states, such as colonial state in, many parts of Africa. It continued to be used in Afghanistan. It continued to be used in many parts, where states, post-colonial states, are engaging in counterinsurgency. Now, basically, what you have in the context of Mizo Hills or Mizoram is that civilian populations were uprooted from their villages and moved to designated or detention centers. So basically, they were grouped into larger villages. So as in the case of Mizoram specifically, the village grouping was part of, the strategy to isolate civilian populations from the MNF rebels in larger villages. Essentially, it makes, the civilian populations legible and manageable to the state. Now, in the context of Mizo Hills, it was undertaken in 4 phases, starting from 1967, and by the 4 phases, sometime in the year, the 4 phases was undertaken in sometime in the year 1970. So close to 90% of the entire population of Mizoram was covered under the scheme. So leaving out, only the southern regions, which were inhabited by the Lai, Mara, and Chakma communities. Now, village grouping, the period of village grouping occupies, a very, very important phase in Mizo history, because the larger civilians or the Mizo public look back at the period of village grouping as one of the most darkest chapters in Mizo history, as it destroys the community life, where hundreds and hundreds of villages were razed to the ground, burnt in the process of the grouping villages. So in Mizoram, in Mizoram, people generally call it as a kind of ram buai sernung, basically a collective scar that remains in the public memory. Now, in many ways, the counterinsurgency policy through village grouping was very successful in terms of achieving its objectives, that civilian populations being segregated from the MNF rebels. For instance, due to the grouping, the MNF, the rebels relocated themselves to Chittagong Hills Trek, which was then East Pakistan, now Bangladesh. At the same time, during the 20 years of the MNF movement, there was a mass censorship of media, and any kind of print materials were confiscated and burned. So at the same time, when I did my field work, I was also quite struck by, the kind of total absence or erasure of records about the grouping. So there is no memorial sites associated with it. Mizoram State Archives, does not have a single record, as far as my knowledge goes, on village grouping, particularly the sufferings of the civilians. Now, in such contexts, people fall back to the oral to express their anguish and record their lives. And this gave birth to a new genre of songs that came to be known as Rambuaila, that is, songs of the troubled times. Now, Rambuaila is significant because it escaped censorship, because they were expressed in the vernacular. And the emergence of Rambuaila is also made possible because of the oral nature of Mizo society. Now, today, it is with Rambuaila that we can access how the common people in Mizoram experience village groupings, violence, and what it means to live under fear and reprisals from both the Indian security forces and the MNF rebels. Now, to put it shortly, Rambuaila, tells us the story of what counterinsurgency and violence by the state and non-state actors does to people.
Right. Could you now throw some light on the politics for peace in the state that eventually led to the signing of the Mizo Accord in 1986?
Yeah. Well, politics. The politics. I call it the politics for peace. Basically, my use of politics for peace hinge on the argument that peace is political. While a normative, conceptualization of peace entails it as a benevolent act where peace is projected as, a common good, such understanding or view, depoliticize the peace process, as if, there is no politics associated with peace. Now, therefore, politics for peace in my book, or in my understanding, or how I use it, rejects the conceptualization of peace in terms of one-way understanding that puts the state role as its focus. So it turns our attention to the diverse actors and the complexity of social, economic, and political processes involved in it. So, for example, in the context of the MNF movement, the politics for peace, whether it was led by the central, the government of India, or whether it was, led by the local governments in Mizoram, it was not always, necessarily in the interest of bringing back law and order or normalcy in Mizo Hills. So there was, a lot of power struggles and political tussles that was, that was happening in the name of peace. So, for example, to elaborate with a case, the Mizo National Front movement started in the year 1966, and exactly after 1 decade, that is in the year 1976, the MNF and the government of India, under the leadership of Indira Gandhi, who was the then prime minister, entered into a first ceasefire agreement. Now, it was in the year 1966, and then in 1977 we have the national emergency, and post national emergency we have the Janata government that came to power. Now, with the change of guards in Delhi, what we see is that the Janata government was no longer interested to talk to the MNF rebels, and the peace process get derailed. And on the other hand, what the Janata government also did was that it began to support the rival political formations that were against the MNF movement within Mizo Hills. So by the 1980s, counterinsurgency violence, resumed. And also there was, a lot of internecine killings, basically factional wars and killings within Mizo Hills or Mizoram. However, with the fall of Janata government, in the year 1979 or 80, and Congress, the peace process, resumed. And by the, early 1980s, what we have is, a political environment for peace was created, not only by the central government, but also by the Congress, the Congress leadership in these fields. So essentially what we have is that, that peace, in many ways is, embedded with, local politics, the interests, of the central state. So I think, an oversight, the kind of, political discourse or the kind of scholarly writings about peace process, in the context of Mizoram and beyond, present often, tend to present it as, something which is devoid of any kind of politics. So I think, it is important to bring back, politics when we are even looking and studying peace.
Where you engage, in your book, you engage with the critical subject of how Mizo nationalism is perceived within larger national politics. Could you highlight some of the themes in it, and why is there a need to rethink the same?
Well, yes. So post the Accord period, post 1986, post the signing of the Mizo Accord, there is, hardly any talk about Mizo nationalism. And, the focus has entirely shifted towards, political stability of Mizoram, or what, is now referred to as peace model. So in many ways, the gaze has shifted, or, the kind of there is an obsession about why Mizoram, succeeded in terms of, maintaining peace and stability, whereas, other parts of the northeastern states did not. Now, in many ways, it is quite puzzling, particularly, when one looks at, Northeast India. And, there has been, a lot of excellent works that are produced around this subject. But the problem is that, while the analysis of, this peace model or peace in Mizoram is important, there is also, a politics of silencing and erasure that is happening. One is that, nowhere, there is a talk about the question of justice. Now, justice in terms of, the kind of, civilian sufferings that were, people experienced during the 20 years of MNF movement. There is no talk about it. So stability and peace is largely, has to do about that, there is no more, MNF, which is, running a kind of, armed insurgency in Mizoram. Now, the other is that, it also, it does not really tell us about, the contemporary political mobilizations in Mizoram. Now, even as a researcher, when I was doing my field work and when I went out, in different parts of India to present my work. So I have, observed that, many people, were quite surprised that I studied the MNF movement. One of the questions was that, why do you study MNF movement? It is already over. Now, these kind of, questions, to my mind, emerged largely because Mizo nationalism is, equated with the MNF. That is one. The other aspect is that, it totally, negates the kind of ethnic tensions, political mobilizations that is happening in Mizoram, in contemporary Mizo society. For example, maybe, for 3 to 4 years back, there was an attempt to name a Mizo tribal hero, Kwang Chera, as Indian freedom fighter. Now, many Mizo public, were opposed to the idea of naming a Mizo tribal hero as an Indian freedom fighter, because they consider it as inappropriate and an act, that distorts Mizo history. Now, many, there was, of course, there was a general agreement that Kwang Chera is a Mizo tribal hero. He fought against the British. But then the Mizo's public interpret as he fought against the British, not necessarily for India, but he fought for Mizo, but not necessarily for India. Because when Kwang Chera was, resisting the expansion of colonial state in Mizoram, Mizoram was still, not even part of, British India Empire. So we continue to see such kind of tensions even till today in contemporary Mizo society. So an overemphasis, on the peace or the stability of Mizoram can, potentially result into an oversight of the kind of tensions between majority Mizos and minority communities such as the Chakmas and the Brus. Likewise, in the last, 5 years, we have seen that, there are strong political mobilizations in Mizoram with a very, very strong nationalist fervor, with a strong nationalist intent. So it is this that, what I think is worth rethinking in terms of how we engage with the subject of ethnicity and nationalism in the context of Mizoram and beyond.
Thank you, Puia. Now we've come to a final question, and I think this question will be very important for several of our listeners. And my question to you is about your field work, because on several occasions, when researchers go into the field, they're faced with different challenges, and these are things that we've maybe in a more informal setting spoken about and discussed. So here, when you were carrying out field work for your book, what were the challenges that you encountered in the field? And could you also talk about the peculiarities of working with oral traditions?
Yeah, I think this is, very fundamental and important. Also, I don't have, a clear-cut response to that. But, there are, I can recall, several challenges that I encounter in the field. But, I would like to stick to 2 issues here. One is doing research in, what is, mostly known as disturbed field or violent fields. And second is, my own positionality as a researcher. So, these 2 issues, come back and forth while doing research. And it in many ways, has given me an opportunity or avenues to think and reflect on the kind of work that I do. Now, coming to the first, by and large, doing research in disturbed, fields such as Manipur, because my field, cuts across, these state boundaries. So I did field work in Manipur, Tripura, and Mizoram. So one, gets, exposed to, risks and threat, and this can put, a researcher in a vulnerable positions with little safety and protection. For example, how much, our how much our institutional affiliation will protect us in the face of, threats from, different groups, particularly when you are working, on something that, is considered to be very political, particularly given that, MNF movement in itself is, deeply politicized even till today. and how, people look back at the movement depends on, their socio-political positioning today and during the period of the movement. So, so, so in many ways, from outside, from the outside, being a Mizo myself, one could, assume that, I'm an insider. Whether I go to Manipur, whether I go to Mizoram, whether I go to Tripura. Now, and this is something, that occurred to me when I did my fieldwork, is that, my identity as a Mizo, whether I'm an insider in Manipur, whether I'm an insider in Mizoram, oscillates like a pendulum according to my respondent. How they view, how they look at me, how they, relate to my identity. So, for example, in Manipur, ethnic politics is something which is, very, very dominant in the state. And your ethnic identity, to a very large extent, also, determine the kind of political allegiance that you have. So, as a researcher, you go and meet people, the first thing you tell them is that your name. And my name is a very typical Mizo name. So it is very easy for anyone to identify that I am Mizo. So on many occasions, what I have seen is that the kind of response, the kind of relationships that I build, the kind of narratives that I get from my respondents, largely hinge on the way in which they look at me, on the way in which they look at the movement. Because not everyone, even within Mizoram or Manipur, supported the MNF movement, and they have a very, very different reading and interpretations of the MNF movement. So I think this is some such one challenges that I face. The other is that there were several instances I have written briefly in my book that where I have faced personal threats from different groups. So I necessarily did not talk or write about it in detail, but then these are the kind of exposure one gets when you are working in a politically sensitive space like Northeast India, particularly Manipur, Tripura, Mizoram. The other question which is very important is the peculiarities with working with oral traditions. Now I've never thought about this in the line that you're asking me, but then well, the first thing that comes to mind is that the authenticity of the data. The authenticity of the data, because even with songs, now for example, even with songs, these were songs that are composed in the 1950s and the 1960s, and there were no proper recordings about the songs. Now, one of the biggest challenges that I face is that I have seen different versions of the same song written, the kind of words, the text varies from one book to the other book. So it is very difficult for me to authenticate many of my sources and materials that I have that I collected during my fieldwork. And so in many ways I'm unable to trace the original version of the songs. And with my interview also, largely because people rely on memory. And sometimes there can be inaccuracies, there can be a lot of gaps in terms of the kind of data that you are getting. And I think this is something which is very, very challenging. And also in a context like in Mizoram, where there are no oral archives, and archiving of even print materials is very, very poor. Institutional recordings are still very, very poor. So it is very difficult, it poses, a lot of challenges, when we are trying to work with, something which is, very, very different from the mainstream kind of, research work that we do. But then, it gives me an opportunity because I have started thinking about, say, for example, developing an oral archive of, the kind of, field data that I have, that I've collected over the past, 5 to 7 years. So challenges are there, but it also gives you an opportunity as a researcher to reflect upon and try to do something.
Right. Thank you for that answer. You made some very important and critical points, and I think also I think you've opened some important or undone some threads in doing research with very critical subjects in violent fields, in situations of conflict, and also working with oral traditions. I think a lot of people who work on tribes in India, they have this struggle of working with no proper documents or written work. So it's I think they'll gather a lot from this interview. So having said that, Puia, thank you so much for taking time out and talking to us about your book today. It's a very important book, very timely book, and I hope our viewers grab a copy, they read it, and yes, thank you once again for joining us.
Thank you so much.